Thank you, Dr. Olson, and thank you all for coming. We'll try this another way. Back when Barnett and I started working on this together, which is 1975, we had no idea that the notions we were starting to mess around with, and I mean that quite literally, messing around with some ways of trying to do things, would find some traction in so many different places. We started out with some very different orientations than IMC. IMC starts with notions of marketing, branding, organizations communicating with consumers, and we started with a very mundane notion of two people trying to get along together somehow. And I want to share with you, just for orientation's sake, and let's just take a minute with this, what Barnett said was the moment when he got it. Whether that's a disease or whether it's a good idea remains up to you, but he said this occurred in the early 70s, probably I think he would say late 73, 74, when he couldn't afford a car, bought a motorcycle, and I gotta say, since Barnett's not here, he is no better with mechanical things than I am, and that is really bad. So there he was, he said, University of Kentucky at the time, motorcycle on the sidewalk, trying to fix this thing himself, and along comes a kind of throwback to the 50s character. Leather jacket, silver spikes, hair greased back with a ducktail, and there's Pearce at the time with a heavy beard looking as much like a stereotype professor as I guess you could look in that era, tinkering with a motorcycle, and this guy comes up behind him. Barnett said, I was kind of worried. And then he started looking at me, and he reaches over, he says, I said, He said, the two of us did not exchange one word that you could find in Webster's. The motorcycle got fixed. And gradually, notions like, started to take on some meaning. He said, by the time we had worked together, he said, the guy spent over half an hour with me. And pretty soon I got a grip, said Barnett, on how to make sense of those gestures. And when I didn't, he would try to show me the same thing another way. And I would try to show him what I was trying to do another way. Somehow the motorcycle got fixed. He said, now that's really interesting. Because by any standards of really great, clear communication, this is a disaster. The other thing he said was crucial is not that we understood each other's meaning in the sense of, oh, I know what that means when he says that. It got worked out together. Gestures, grunts, words started taking on a meaning for the two of us as we found ourselves able to coordinate in such a way that the motorcycle got fixed. Said something as there's something else happened in that, and that is he walked away probably very proud of himself when I got the motorcycle to run, drew himself up, and I said, thank you, and he says, yeah, man, and walked away very proud of himself. He said, this did something probably for him along the lines of, there's some things I know that those professors don't know, and they can learn from me. And I learned something about people with that attire, that they're not all aggressive and actually willing to share what they know. And I felt pretty good about that. So he said we had two ideas going on here. First of all, there's nothing fixed about the meanings of the grunts, gestures, groans exchanged. That we created a pattern together, and the more the pattern began to flow, the better we could coordinate, and that there was a story beyond that pattern of fixing the motorcycle, and were stories about who am I, who is he, how do we connect together. He said, that was the point. He said, it's not goodness of fit, it's coordination. And I think that's a very helpful story. Now there's another aspect of that story, and that is you got a couple of things going on there. One thing going on is you got the behaviors. You've got the grunts, the groans, the movements, the tinkering with tools. And then you've got some understandings, maybe not in very pristine English, but some understandings of what are we doing here that's emerging, who are you, who am I, and we both leave with a kind of a story about that. And that's an important insight. It's story, but it's more than story. When I teach this, I use an example from a longtime colleague of mine from London, Peter Lang. When Peter Lang introduces this kind of idea, he tells this story. He said two college friends who hadn't seen each other in years and years run into each other on a street corner in London. One of them is optimistic, bright, happy to see the new day. The other guy, his old friend, is down the dumps. And the depressed-looking guy says to his friend, how can you be so optimistic? The economy's a mess. You have kids, I have kids. Kids can be problems. You got to work that out. Relationships are difficult. Then there's the job, and how much time in the job, how much time in the... How can you stay optimistic with all the stuff that life throws at you? And this optimistic friend says, I'll tell you how I do it. Every morning, I get up, and I go out to my garden. For the Brits, that means the little backyard. And in my garden, I look for and I find the dirtiest, smelliest, ugliest frog I can find. And I pick up that frog, and I look at it, and I swallow it whole. And then I say to myself, that was horrible, and everything else that's going to happen today is going to be better than that. Now they meet, friends, I'll try it. They meet again a couple of weeks later. Pessimistic guy is still down. The friend says, did you try the thing with the frog? He says, yeah, I tried it the next day. I went out to my garden. This one's dirtier, but that one's smellier. Maybe this one's uglier. I finally find the best compromise, smelly, ugly, dirty frog, and I swallowed it whole. And then what? And then I thought to myself, oh my God, that was horrible, and I've got to do the same thing over again tomorrow. Point being, you got to change both the behavior and the story all at the same time, and that's very much part of what CMM is about too. That it's not meaning over here and action over here, it's meaningful action. On the occasion of his 80th birthday, John Dewey was honored by the American Philosophical Association. He belonged to both. And they had a panel in his honor, but he said, I don't want a bunch of papers about my work. You guys present some papers, I'll present a paper. And the paper right before Dewey's is given by an associate professor who said, I really want to, in spite of his talk about I don't want this to be an honoring ceremony, I want to thank Professor Dewey for enriching our notion of meaning with the concept of action. And when Dewey got up to present his paper, he said, my younger colleague has me entirely wrong. I am not trying to enrich the concept of meaning or the idea of meaning with the concept of action. I'm trying to provoke some meaningful action. And that's a very different kind of notion. So from these beginning places, let me tell you about a few of the basic starting places of CMM. Because I think most folks know the basics of CMM. Got it. This sort of joint action idea. We have the notion, and I think most of us share here the notion, that communication is the primary social process within which we make what? Well, we make meanings. We make all sorts of behaviors. We make stories of who we are, who the other is. We make institutions. We make cultures, identities. Yeah, but there's something we haven't talked a great deal about. And that is, we also make ways of thinking. That you cannot separate the way you think from the way in which you learn to communicate. Now, there's a really important message in that, I think, for all of us. And that is, when you attempt to do something, whether it's talking to your spouse or trying to market or give a speech like this, you're not just trying to fit into what people already know. Because to listen is to change. Every time you hear something, now the change may be very, very small, but every time you listen, you've got to somehow listen into the specific way that the other party has spoken. And then you've got to figure out how, under this particular set of exigencies, are you going to respond coherently to that, and not only respond coherently, but to do it in a way that the other person can then take the conversation forward. Now, the implications of that, of course, are tremendous. First implication, thinking isn't just in here. Sure is in there. All kinds of neurons are firing, but we wouldn't think that way exactly except for what the other says and does. And therefore, meaning becomes a conjoint project with another little twist, that it's never finished. Because when you respond, you've got to create possibilities for the next person to act into what you're doing. Now, when I teach this back home in, well, my now former home, since I am officially now unemployed, I use this. Say you go to a party, and what do you usually do at a party? And we talk about that. What's the usual line of party chat for getting things started? And I ask a student to be my interlocutor, and I will say, I'd say, hi, how are you? I'd say, fine. Where do you live? I live in the Southwest Dormitory. Where do you live? My brother found a dead bird in the back seat of his car. Perfectly good English sentence, but where on God's earth do you go with that? Now, what's the point of all this for IMC? That is, when you analyze who are the respondents, not only consumers, but the people inside the organization that you would like to get on board with a new approach to things, that you can't just be thinking about fitting into what they already know, but you have to do that. You got to know where they are. But you also have to take into account, how are your forms of communication changing the way they are going to think and listen and recall as the conversation goes on? Because the darn thing about life is it won't sit still. John Dewey had a nice line, a very anti-Kantian, very evolutionary kind of line. He said, to live is to be in interaction with your environment. When you are no longer accommodating and adapting to that environment, that means you're dead. So we don't have to account for, why do people do anything? People are going to do. What you got to account for is, how are we acting